In the winter of 1882, in the frontier town of Ashford, 18-year-old Nicholas Crawley was cast out into the cold. He pried up the floorboards of the abandoned church and disappeared into the frozen hollow below. The townspeople expected him to freeze, but they didn't know about the bell. When the blizzard buried the village, that bell would ring from beneath the snow, saving his life and forcing the entire town to confront the secret he'd been building in the dark. He was the orphan no one wanted. No family, no work, no shelter. And in a frontier town where charity was as frozen as the ground, a boy without a trade was just another mouth to starve. So the town council put him out. But Nicholas didn't leave. He crawled under the one building nobody prayed in anymore, the locked, abandoned church at the edge of the settlement. There, hidden beneath the floorboards, he began a secret renovation. Why would an outcast spend his nights repairing a place that had rejected him? The answer lived inside that bell tower, and it would force a reckoning nobody in Ashford saw coming. In the autumn of 1882, the frontier town of Ashford was already preparing for a winter the old-timers said would be the worst in a decade. Firewood was stacked shoulder-high against clapboard walls, barrels of salted fish were sealed with wax, and every family with a roof counted their blankets twice. And on the very day the first hard frost turned the wagon ruts to iron, Nicholas Crawley was dragged before the town council and told he had until sundown to leave. He was 18 years old, thin as a fence post, wearing a coat patched so many times it looked like a quilt of miseries. His mother had died the previous spring, his father was long gone, and without a family to vouch for him, he had become exactly what frontier towns feared most. A young man with no purpose, no labor, and no claim on anyone's charity. The council met in the back room of Harlan's general store. The main voice against Nicholas came from Mr. Harlan himself, a broad-shouldered man who had never once allowed a stray dog to loiter near his grain sacks. "Winter's coming," Harlan said, folding thick arms across his chest. "We can't feed a grown boy who won't work." Nicholas had tried to work, but no one would hire him after his mother's illness had forced him to miss a winter contract with the blacksmith. That single broken promise had stained his name with a word that followed him everywhere: unreliable. So the verdict was quick and unanimous. By nightfall, Nicholas stood alone on the north road out of Ashford, carrying nothing but a blanket, a small knife, and a memory of a locked church. That church, St. Agnes, had stood abandoned for 2 winters. Its roof sagged near the bell tower, the floorboards had warped, and the heavy oak doors were chained shut with a rusted lock. The pastor, a weary man named Reverend Thorpe, had left the previous year for a congregation in the east, and no replacement had come. In frontier towns, a church without a shepherd becomes a ghost in plain sight. People walk past it without looking. Children dare each other to peer through its windows. And Nicholas Crawley, shivering in the frozen dark, remembered something better than charity. He remembered the crawl space. Beneath the sanctuary floor, a hollow had been dug years earlier to allow air flow for an old stove that no longer existed. The boards near the north wall were loose enough to lift. He discovered this when he was a boy, hiding during a game of tag. Now, on that first night of banishment, he pried the boards up with numb fingers and lowered himself into the cold dirt chamber. The space was barely high enough to crouch in, smelling of dust and dried rot, but it was out of the wind. That was enough. He pulled the boards back into place above him, sealed himself in darkness, and waited for morning. The plan was not to stay. The plan was one night, then move on. But during that first week, something changed inside Nicholas Crawley. He began noticing the church differently. Not with pity, not with resentment, but with an almost painful attention. He saw a crooked pew he could straighten with a few nails, a gap in the roof where a shingle had slipped, dust so thick on the altar rail it looked like moss. And because he had nothing else to do, no other reason to exist, he began fixing things. Quietly, invisibly, moving only in the deepest hours of night when the town slept, and the wind covered the sound of his hands at work. He scavenged nails from fallen boards in the livery. A broken hammer he found half buried in the smithy's slag pile. Tallow from kitchen scraps became candle fuel. The repairs were slow, methodical, almost reverent. He tightened the pulpit railing that had threatened to collapse. He rehung the sacristy door. He swept the floorboard seams with a broom made from twigs so that no snow would seep through the cracks. And with every repair, the church became less a hiding place and more something else, something the town of Ashford had long forgotten, a sacred place worth saving. But survival was still measured in hunger. Twice a week, Nicholas would slip out through the crawl space long after midnight and search the refuse piles behind the stores. Old bread crusts from the bakery that had frozen before they could be given to pigs, potato peelings, once an entire boiled egg that had rolled under a crate. The cold kept everything from spoiling, but it also meant he was always trembling, always burning more of himself just to stay warm. He slept in his coat, wrapped in the old blanket, listening to the wind push against the sagging bell tower overhead. In those long hours, he would often stare upward into the dark, toward the silent bell above, and wonder what it would sound like if it ever rang again. The bell had not been rung since the final Sunday service when Reverend Thorpe had locked the doors. Old man Crawford, who had been the town's sexton before the church closed, once said the bell was cracked near the crown, sending a flat note that made Bobbies cry. But it still hung in the tower, its pull rope dangling all the way down to the vestibule, untouched, rotted from years of moisture. Nicholas had seen it on one of his first cautious climbs, a thick hemp line frayed and stiff, yet still connected. He touched it only once, and the entire mechanism groaned above him like a sleeping animal stirring. Weeks passed. December brought the first real snow, and the crawl space became colder than any barn. Ice formed on the underside of the floorboards. Nicholas's breath rose in small clouds he could see by the thin crack of daylight that leaked through the boarded windows. He had repaired the outer walls enough that the wind no longer whistled through the sanctuary, but there was no fixing the bitter temperature. So he began working harder at night just to keep his blood moving, scraping ice from the altar cloth, resetting the loose flagstones near the pulpit. He had no audience, no thanks, no promise of spring. But something inside him had begun to believe that if he could just restore the church, maybe, somehow, it would restore him in return. The first clue that his work was being noticed came on a moonless night in the second week of December. Nicholas had finished resetting a trio of candlesticks when he heard voices outside the building. He froze. Two men were walking past on the frozen road, their shadows jerking in the faint glow of a lantern. One of them, Harlan's voice, unmistakable, muttered, "That church looks straighter, roof don't sag as bad." His companion laughed. "Wind probably blew the dust off. Nobody's been inside since the lock rusted shut." Their footsteps faded into the cold, but Nicholas remained motionless for an hour after, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had been seen, or rather his repairs had been seen. The difference meant everything. Then the great blizzard arrived. It began as a strange silence in the middle of the afternoon, as if the entire sky had inhaled and refused to exhale. The old settlers called that stillness the held breath of winter, and when the breath released, it was with a ferocity that no one in Ashford had witnessed in a generation. Wind screamed down from the northern ridge, shaking every building to its foundations. Snow fell not in flakes but in a solid white wall, burying fences, smothering windows, packing drifts against doors until no one could open them. Inside the crawl space, Nicholas felt the temperature plunge and heard the church groan around him. He crawled to his entrance point and pushed upward. The floorboards would not move. A massive drift had sealed the north wall. He was buried alive. Hours passed. The blizzard howled. Nicholas's candle had long since gone out and the darkness was absolute. He tried digging at the frozen dirt around the foundation, but it was like clawing at iron. His body was losing heat fast. In the blackness, he began to accept what was coming. That was when his hand brushed against the old pull rope in the vestibule. He followed it upward with his fingers, remembering the bell above. If he could ring it, the sound might carry. He had nothing to lose but the final few breaths in his lungs. Using the last of his strength, he climbed the narrow tower ladder in total darkness, feeling for the frayed rope. He found it, brittle and frozen, and knew it would snap if pulled hard. But he had saved a length of sturdy cord from the curtain rods he had repaired weeks earlier. weaving it into a spare rope he kept in his coat pocket for emergencies. With cold stiffened fingers, he spliced it to the bell's clapper and fed it down through the old pulley. The rope was rough, but it would hold. He descended, braced his feet against the floor, and pulled. The sound that erupted from the tower was not a clean note. It was a deep, shuddering clang that seemed to shake the ice from the rafters, a cracked and urgent voice that cut through the roaring wind like a knife. The bell of St. Agnes, silent for 2 winters, was ringing across the frozen town. In their houses, families stopped their prayers. Harlan dropped a tin cup. And every living soul in Ashford turned toward the abandoned church, certain of one terrible and impossible truth. Something was calling them from beneath the snow. The bells clanged tore through the blizzard, and in that instant the town of Ashford forgot its fear. Men grabbed shovels, women wrapped shawls around their faces, and a grim procession stumbled toward the abandoned church. Harlan led the way, his lantern swinging through the blinding snow, his mouth pressed into a hard, disbelieving line. The sound was not a clean call to worship. It was a frantic, desperate pounding, as if the bell itself was pleading. Each stroke seemed to say, "Help, help, help," and the people answered, because if someone was inside the locked, ruined church, then the rules of everything had changed. When they reached the north wall, they found the drift that had sealed Nicholas inside towering over their heads. The men attacked it with shovels, heaving snow aside in great white waves. Harlan barked orders, his voice cracking with the cold. It took 20 minutes to uncover the buried door, and when they finally forced it open and poured into the vestibule, lantern light fell on something none of them expected. The floorboards had been lifted from their joists, and a thin hand, blue with cold, was still gripping a frayed rope that snaked upward through the hole. Nicholas Crawley, the outcast they had banished weeks before, was curled in the hollow beneath the floor, barely conscious, shivering so violently his teeth clicked together. They pulled him up, and Harlan's wife, Anne, wrapped him in her own cloak. But it was what they saw in the sanctuary that truly silenced them. The church was not the ruin they remembered. The pews stood straight, the altar cloth was clean, candle stubs sat in repaired holders, and the floor, swept free of dust, gleamed faintly in the lantern glow. Someone had been mending this place in secret for weeks, and the only possible culprit was the half-frozen boy now gasping for air in the vestibule. Harlan stared at the neat rows of pews, his jaw working silently. "Who gave you permission?" he finally demanded. Nicholas could barely speak, his words coming in shallow, steam-thin bursts. "No one," he shivered again. "But it was the only roof that would have me." The town stood in the sanctuary, snow melting in puddles at their feet, and for the first time they saw not a vagrant but the evidence of an entire winter's devotion. The rafters had been propped with splints of wood where rot had eaten them. The broken window over the pulpit had been sealed with thin strips of cloth taken from old grain sacks. Every hinge, every latch, every worn floorboard whispered of a patience that food scraps and frozen nights should have made impossible. And as the lantern light shifted, they noticed something else. The bell rope that Nicholas had pulled was not the original. Beside it, the ruined original still hung, rotted and slack. He had spliced a new line from saved curtain cord, carefully rigging it so the cracked bell would ring without snapping free. Anne Harlan turned to her husband, her voice tight. "This boy saved the church. He nearly died ringing that bell to call us. What are you going to do, put him back outside?" Harlan said nothing, but the question hung in the air like smoke. The blizzard howled around the building, and suddenly the church, which had been a dead place for 2 winters, felt like the only sanctuary for miles. The gathering that night was not a council meeting. It was an impromptu vigil. Families brought blankets, broth, and what little warmth they could spare, while Nicholas lay on a pew, too weak to stand. Some people muttered that it was a miracle. Others whispered that it was a judgment, that they had turned their backs on an orphan, and God had used the orphan to restore his house. But Harlan saw only a violation. A boy had trespassed, broken into locked property, and no amount of scrubbing or hammering could erase the fact that he had done it in defiance of the council's order. "He can't stay," Harlan repeated to anyone who would listen. "One good deed doesn't erase the rule." That was when old Esther MacRae, the midwife who had delivered nearly every child in Ashford, stood slowly from the front pew. She had been sitting in silence the entire time, her gnarled hands folded over her cane. The rule was to cast out a burden, she said, her voice carrying the same weight as the bell. But the boy you cast out has become the only one who cared for this place. So maybe you misjudged which side of the wall the burden was on. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Harlan stiffened but did not reply. That night, while the blizzard continued to rage, Nicholas finally spoke in full sentences. Warmed by broth and surrounded by people who, days earlier, would have crossed the street to avoid him, he told them the story they hadn't asked to hear. His mother, Margaret Crawley, had been a seamstress who fell ill in the spring and never recovered. His father, a woodsman, had died years before in a timber accident. Nicholas had been left with nothing but her final words: "Take care of something, even if it isn't yours, and eventually it will belong to you." So when the council told him to leave, he had simply found the one thing no one else wanted, and he had cared for it. He never intended to stay the winter, but as the cold set in and the repairs mounted, the church had become his purpose. Then he told them a detail that made even Harlan pause. 3 days before the blizzard, Nicholas had discovered something in the bell tower, a small, rusted lockbox hidden behind the clapper beam. Inside was a letter from Reverend Thorpe, dated the year the church closed, and a key to the church's front door. The letter, written in a shaking hand, confessed that Thorpe had not left Ashford simply for another congregation. He had fled because the church had become a place of shame after a farmer's son had died during a Sunday service, struck by a heart ailment, and the town had blamed the pastor for not having a doctor present. Thorpe wrote, "I locked this place because I could no longer bear to look upon it. But if you find this, whoever you are, know that the church was never meant to be a tomb. It was meant to be a refuge." The revelation rewrote everyone's memory. Chesterton, the dead boy, had been the son of a prominent family. His death had fractured the congregation, and the guilt had slowly emptied the pews. Thorpe had gone east, but not before locking the building and hiding the letter, perhaps hoping someday someone would finish what he could not. Nicholas had not broken into a sacred space. He had stumbled into a wound the entire town had refused to heal. Harlan, who had been one of the loudest voices against the pastor after the death, sat heavily on the restored pew and stared at the floor. The blizzard outside had begun to wane, the wind turning into a low, keening moan. The people huddled together, and for a moment the church felt less like a building and more like a vessel carrying them all through a dark sea. Then the door burst open again, and a man stumbled and coated in snow. It was Joseph Pike, the young freight runner who supplied goods from the railhead 30 miles east. He had been caught in the storm and followed the sound of the bell, fearing he would freeze. In his arms he carried a bundle of post and a single, oilcloth-wrapped letter addressed to the Ashford Town Council. The letter was from a bishop in the diocese headquarters, who had heard rumors that the abandoned church was being vandalized, and that the council intended to sell the property to a timber company that wanted the land. The bishop, having learned of the situation through distant parish channels, had dispatched a circuit preacher named Father Harmon to reopen the church or, if necessary, deconsecrate it. Father Harmon would arrive by spring. The timing sent a shock through the gathering. If Nicholas had not rung the bell, if the blizzard had not brought them together, the church might have been sold and torn down before anyone knew the truth. But now they had a chance to present a restored sanctuary to the visiting preacher. The question of what to do with Nicholas suddenly shifted. He was no longer just a trespasser. He was the only person who knew every nail, every beam, every hidden flaw in the building. He had become, in the space of a single night, the unofficial keeper of a church that might still have a future. But Harlan, watching the townsfolk rally around the boy, felt his authority slipping. In the final hour before dawn, he made a last stand. He pointed to the floor where Nicholas had been buried alive. That hideaway saved him, but it also means he was living beneath this floor for weeks, stealing food, hiding like an animal. What's to stop every drifter from doing the same? If we reward this, we throw open the gates to chaos. His voice was calm, but the edge was sharp. Tomorrow we dig him a shelter on the edge of town, and he can stay there until spring. But he does not get to claim a building none of us were brave enough to fix. Nicholas, still too weak to argue, closed his eyes. The bell had saved his life, but it had also exposed him to the same judgment that had cast him out. And as the last of the blizzard moaned against the rafters, a new tension took hold. The town was divided not over whether to save the church, but over whether they could accept that a boy they had thrown away was the one worthy to protect it. Then someone noticed the water. It began as a slow seep, trickling down the eastern wall beneath the patched window. During the storm, snow had packed into a crack Nicholas had not found yet, and now that the interior was warming with all the bodies and lanterns, the snow had begun to melt. The water ran in a thin stream across the floor toward the pulpit, and as it pooled, it exposed a weakness no one had seen. The limestone foundation beneath that wall had been slowly disintegrating from years of improper drainage. The entire eastern corner of the church was unstable, and if another heavy snow came before repairs, the bell tower might collapse entirely. The bell that had just saved them all was now hanging in a structure that could kill anyone beneath it. In the stunned silence, Nicholas opened his eyes again, and with the last of his strength, whispered a solution that only he could offer. He knew every weak point on that wall because he had already been propping it up with wooden braces he'd cut himself. But those braces were temporary. To make the repairs permanent before spring thaw, they would need to open the foundation, work in frozen earth, and reinforce the stone while the weather was still bitter. And that would require someone small enough to crawl into the foundation space and skilled enough to do the stonework. Nicholas was that someone. He had done everything else, and now the church itself was demanding that the town not only accept him, but actively need him. The choice was no longer about punishment. It was about survival. Harlan's face was unreadable as he looked from the seeping wall to the boy who had already spent weeks beneath the floor. The bell had called the town together. Now the shifting stones were forcing them to remake their conscience. The sun would rise soon, but before it did, Ashford would have to decide. Was Nicholas Crawley a curse they had to bury, or the one builder who could keep their history from collapsing on top of them? And somewhere high above, the cracked bell, silent now, still held the answer they were all too afraid to speak aloud. By the time the gray winter dawn finally broke over Ashford, the town had already divided itself in two. Half the people gathered in the church sanctuary believed they had witnessed something close to a miracle. A boy buried alive, a bell rung from beneath the snow, a neglected building somehow still standing because of his secret work. The other half, led by Harlan, believed that a miracle and a violation could not occupy the same ledger, and if the town rewarded one, it invited 100 others. But the water still ran down the eastern wall, a slow, cold trickle that refused to be ignored, and it was the water that finally forced the argument to a head. Anne Harlan, wrapping a dry shawl around Nicholas's shoulders, looked at her husband with an expression that carried more disappointment than anger. "The church is rotting around us, Martin," she said, "and the only person who knows what's wrong with it is the boy you want to throw out again. Is your pride worth a bell tower coming down on someone's head?" Harlan's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, a sharp crack echoed from somewhere high above. Every face tilted upward. Dust sifted from the rafters. A chunk of old plaster the size of a dinner plate crashed onto a pew, splintering the wood. The bell tower had shifted. The problem was no longer theoretical. Something had given way in the foundation, and if they did not act immediately, the entire tower might collapse. In a frontier town, a collapsed bell tower was not just a tragedy, it was a judgment. It would confirm everything the timber company wanted the bishop to believe, that this church was beyond saving. Nicholas forced himself upright, his legs trembling beneath him. "I can fix it," he said. His voice was thin but steady. "But I have to work from underneath. The braces I made are in the crawl space around the foundation. I need wood, mortar, and a lantern." He should not have been able to stand. He had been buried in frozen earth, starved for weeks, nearly frozen to death. Yet something in his eyes made the men pause. It was not the wild determination of a desperate boy, but the calm, methodical assurance of someone who had already solved the problem twice in his head. Harlan started to object, but Joseph Pike, the freight runner who had stumbled in during the blizzard, stepped forward. "I'll help him," he said. "My wagon's buried, but I've got lumber strapped to it. Good oak." That was the crack in the dam. Esther Mac Ray stood again, her cane tapping once against the stone floor. "I'll send Caleb with a mortar tub." Within minutes, the gathering had transformed from a vigil into a work crew. Harlan watched it happen, his authority draining away with every volunteer who stepped forward. If there had been any doubt that the town had shifted, it vanished when Constance, the baker's widow, returned with a pot of hot broth and pressed it into Nicholas's hands. "Drink," she said. "You're no good to us if you faint in the hole." Nicholas did not faint. He drank the broth, pulled on a borrowed coat, and led a small party around to the foundation on the eastern side. The snow was still deep, but the men dug a narrow trench along the wall until they exposed the limestone base. What they found stopped them cold. The drainage problem was not natural. A trench had been cut through the ground years ago, likely during the church's construction, to direct water away from the foundation. But something had altered that channel recently. The ground was gouged in a straight line, as if someone had deliberately diverted the flow back toward the building. Nicholas noticed it immediately. "Look at the frost marks on the rock," he said, pointing with a trembling finger. This wasn't melt, it was forced water. Harlan had followed them outside, and when he saw the diverted drainage, the color drained from his face. It was not guilt exactly, not yet, but it was recognition. Joseph Pike studied the ground, then looked up sharply. "This trench runs toward the old sawmill sluice. Someone redirected the runoff from the mill toward the church." "Who would do that?" Anne Harlan asked. And in the terrible silence that followed, a name formed in the air before anyone dared speak it. The Timber Company. The old sawmill, abandoned for 3 years, was owned by the same company that now wanted to buy the church land. If the church were deemed unsafe, the sale would be expedited. If the foundation failed entirely, the land would be cleared without any objection from the diocese. The logic was brutal and clean. And the realization that the church's decay was not an accident, but the result of deliberate sabotage, sent a wave of fury through the gathered townspeople. But Nicholas did not have time for fury. He had already lowered himself into the dug trench, crawling carefully into the narrow space beneath the floorboards where the worst of the rot had taken hold. The crawl space under the church was darker and colder than the hollow beneath the floor where he had slept. Here, the earth was wet and heavy, pressing against the limestone blocks. Water trickled audibly somewhere nearby. Nicholas held the lantern in one hand and felt along the stone with the other, tracing the seams with the same careful attention he had given every other part of the building. He found 3 places where the mortar had completely crumbled, the blocks themselves beginning to separate. A heavy, wet slab of rock was slipping outward, and it was that slippage that had torqued the joists above, causing the bell tower to shift. He called for a bucket of mortar and a thick oak beam. Joseph Pike lowered both down, and Nicholas began working in the tight space, packing mortar into the gaps with numb fingers while bracing the slipping slab with the beam. The position forced him to kneel in icy mud, his shoulders wedged against the floor joists, his breath condensing in thick clouds. Any wrong move could dislodge the slab entirely and drop half the eastern wall onto his back. And yet he worked with a precision that made the men above fall silent, watching his small, careful movements as if they were witnessing something sacred. 2 hours later, the braces were in place. Not permanent, but enough to hold until spring thaw, enough to stop the bell tower from dropping another inch. Nicholas hauled himself out of the trench, coated in mud and shivering so hard his teeth chattered, and found the entire town waiting for him. The sky had opened to a pale, icy blue, and the sun cast long, weak shadows across the snow. Anne Harlan held out a dry blanket, and this time Harlan did not object. He stood off to the side, arms crossed, staring at the repaired foundation as if it were a puzzle he could not solve. Then Joseph Pike spoke the words that no one else would say. "We need to find out who redirected that drainage. If we don't stop it, the water will just come back in the spring." He looked directly at Harlan. "You've dealt with the timber company before. Who would have ordered this?" Harlan's silence stretched. Then slowly he said, "Borden. His name is Borden. He runs the sawmill accounts. He told me months ago that the church was a blight, that the land was better used for timber. I thought he meant the trees. He meant the building, Constance said, her voice hard. The revelation reshaped the morning's miracle. The bell that had saved Nicholas had also exposed a slow conspiracy to erase the church from existence. And now that the town knew, the stakes were no longer about one boy and a ruin. They were about whether Ashford would allow its own history to be quietly demolished for profit. The bishop's letter, still tucked inside Joseph Pike's coat, suddenly felt like a weapon. If they could restore the church and present it as a living congregation before spring, the sale could be blocked. But to do that, they needed more than a stable foundation. They needed a church that could hold a service. They needed a pastor. And they needed enough of the town's families to swear themselves to a spiritual home that had been a tomb for 2 winters. That night, a second gathering formed inside the sanctuary, larger than the first. Every lantern in Ashford seemed to flicker between the pews. Nicholas sat near the front, wrapped in blankets, his body finally beginning to warm. He did not speak. He had already spoken enough with his hands. The discussion that followed lasted for hours. Some families were reluctant to commit. Others were afraid of what the timber company might do if the sale was blocked. But Esther Mac Ray, who had delivered half of them into the world, silenced the hesitation with a single sentence. If this church falls, every church in this territory will fall. Because it will mean that men with money can decide what is sacred and what is not. A vote was called, not by hands but by voices. One by one, the families of Ashford stood and pledged to attend the first service when the bell rang again. 17 families in total, enough by the old rules to form a legitimate congregation. And when the last voice fell silent, a new sound filled the sanctuary, the low, steady crackle of the stove, lit for the first time in 2 years. The heat spread slowly through the room, chasing the frost from the corners, and somewhere in that warmth Harlan finally unbent. He walked to the front, not with the stride of a confident merchant, but with the heavy step of a man carrying a weight he had denied too long. He stopped in front of Nicholas. "I won't pretend I was wrong about everything," he said, "but I was wrong about you." He extended his hand. Nicholas looked at it for a long moment, then shook it. The gesture was small, but it sealed something larger than a truce. It sealed the town's pact with its own conscience. Then the bell rang again, not the frantic, desperate clang of the blizzard night, but a slow, deliberate tolling. 1 note, 2, 3. Joseph Pike had climbed the tower and pulled the rope to test the repair. The sound rolled across the snow-covered rooftops, and in every house that heard it, someone paused in their work and remembered that the church was no longer abandoned. The cracked bell's uneven tone still made Bobby's cry, but it was the sound of something waking up. And waking up is precisely what Borden heard. 3 miles away, at the edge of the company's lumber camp, he paused with his ledger in hand and listened to the distant tolling. He had heard rumors of the bell ringing during the storm, but this was different. This was resolute. He sent for a horse and told his foreman to clear the morning's schedule. He would ride to Ashford himself to see what had changed. But the bell ringing was only the beginning. Later that night, while Nicholas finally slept in a pew, his body finally still, Joseph Pike made one more discovery. Sorting through the old vestry chest, he found a sheaf of papers that Reverend Thorpe had left behind. Most were old sermons, mildewed and unreadable. But one document was dry and preserved inside a leather folio. The original church charter, dated 1846, signed by the founding families of Ashford. And among those signatures was a name that made Joseph stop breathing. At the very bottom of the list, in a careful, looping hand, was the signature of Eli Crawley, Nicholas's grandfather. The Crawley family had not only helped build the church, they had donated the land beneath it. The next morning, when Nicholas was told, he stared at the document for a full minute without speaking. His mother had never mentioned it. Perhaps she had been too ashamed of their family's fallen station. Or perhaps she had simply believed that deeds written on paper mattered less than deeds written in hammer strikes. But the truth was now unavoidable. Nicholas Crawley was not a trespasser. He was the grandson of the man who had given the ground for the sanctuary. And according to the charter's terms, if the church ever faced dissolution, the land was to revert to the Crawley heirs. That was when it got worse, because Borden arrived before midday. He was a lean, neat man with a cold smile and a leather satchel containing a copy of the sale agreement, nearly finalized. He walked into the church as if he already owned it, his boots clicking on the restored floor, and he stopped short when he saw the full sanctuary. The clean windows, the repaired pews, the stove glowing warm, and the townspeople standing shoulder to shoulder with Harlan at their side. Borden's smile did not falter, but his eyes moved quickly, calculating. "I see you've been busy," he said, "but it won't matter. The sale is approved by the bishop's office. The church is deconsecrated as of the inspector's report. You're sitting in a condemned building." Joseph stepped forward. "The bishop's letter in my coat says otherwise. A circuit preacher is coming in the spring to rededicate the church. You can't sell what's about to be resurrected." Borden's smile finally cracked. "Resurrected? Look at this place. The bell is cracked. The foundation is failing. The pastor fled. You have no priest, no charter of active worship, and no legal standing to block a purchase that's already been logged in the territorial capital." Harlan, to his credit, did not flinch. "We have a charter," he said, holding up the folio, "and we have something else. The land beneath this church was donated by the Crawley family with a reversion clause. You can't buy the building without the ground." The silence that followed was absolute. Borden stared at the charter, his face unreadable. Then he laughed, a short, hard sound. "The Crawley family is extinct. There's no one left to claim the reversion." Every eye in the room turned to Nicholas. He stood slowly, the blanket still around his shoulders, and met Borden's gaze. "I'm Nicholas Crawley. Eli was my grandfather, and I've been living in this church for weeks, so the claim isn't dead. It's standing right here." The color drained from Borden's face. Not from fear, but from the realization that his entire plan, the diversion of water, the quiet pressure on the diocese, the months of legal maneuvering, was about to collapse because a homeless boy had climbed under a floor and refused to die. His hand tightened on the satchel. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "The river is going to be a problem for you, Nicholas Crawley. You don't know what's coming." And then he left, the door swinging shut behind him with a heavy thud. It was only later, when the town finally understood what Borden meant by the river, that the true danger became clear. The diversion of the drainage was not the only sabotage. Upstream, the timber company had been clear-cutting the hillside that held back the snowmelt. Without the deep-rooted pines, the ground was already unstable. When the thaw came, the meltwater would not drain gradually. It would channel into a single, furious current, sweeping down the old sawmill sluice and straight through the center of Ashford. The church, sitting near the lowest point, would be the first building hit. And if it collapsed, everything, the charter, the repairs, the legacy, would be swept away in a single afternoon. The town had united behind Nicholas. The church was restored. The bell could ring. But the true battle was not against a timber company's greed or a town's harsh judgment. It was against the very water that had been weaponized against them. And only one person in Ashford had spent weeks studying the flow of water through frozen ground, tracing every seep and crack, understanding how a current could be broken apart and redirected. Nicholas Crawley had learned the church's secrets from the crawl space upward. Now, he would have to learn how to break a flood the way Parker Vale once taught a blizzard where to break. The thaw came earlier than anyone feared. By the first week of March, the snow on the northern ridges began to soften, and the creek that fed the sawmill sluice swelled to a dark, dangerous ribbon. Nicholas spent those days walking the frozen banks with Joseph Pike, mapping every channel that water might carve once the melt hit full force. He studied the clear-cut hillside upstream, where the timber company had stripped the pines down to raw earth, and what he saw made his stomach knot. Without roots to hold the soil, the entire slope was a bowl waiting to spill. Borden hadn't just diverted a drainage trench. He had engineered a catastrophe that would look like nature's doing. And when it hit, the whole town would blame the church for being in the way. Nicholas returned to the crawl space not to hide, but to listen. He pressed his hands against the limestone foundation, feeling the cold seep of water that already trickled through the diverted channel. He traced the path from the mill sluice to the eastern wall, and then he did something no one expected. He crawled the entire underground length of the church, mapping where the water pressure was strongest, where the stones had shifted, where the current would strike first. By the time he emerged, coated in mud and shaking, he had a plan. It was not a wall to stop the water. It was a series of angled berms and shallow trenches designed to split the flood current into smaller, weaker channels, exactly as the cedar rings had once broken the Dakota wind. He would teach the water to defeat itself. Harlan, now fully committed, emptied his lumber shed. "Use everything," he said, his voice raw. "Every plank, every pole, every nail." Joseph Pike and a dozen men hauled oak beams from the freight wagon and began digging the diversion lines Nicholas marked in the frozen ground. They drove posts into the earth at sharp angles, lashing crossbeams to create baffles that would shear the water into gentle ribbons. Old Esther MacRae, who had not lifted a shovel in years, stood at the edge of the work with a pot of hot coffee and a fierce, wordless determination. Constance and the other women formed a chain, passing stones and sandbags from the creek bed to reinforce the berms. For 3 days, Ashford did not sleep. The work was brutal, measured in blisters and frozen fingers, but no one complained. They were no longer saving a building. They were saving the proof that they were not the kind of people Borden thought they were. Borden returned on the third evening, this time with a county land agent and a document bearing the diocese seal. He stood at the edge of the work, watching the town toil in the half-dark, and his cold smile was back in place. "I have a court order," he announced, holding the paper aloft. "The church is deconsecrated by episcopal authority. You're to cease all construction and vacate the premises immediately." Harlan walked up the muddy slope, wiping his hands on his coat. He took the paper, read it carefully, and then handed it to Nicholas. Nicholas, still breathing hard from the latest crawl, looked at the seal. It was the bishop's stamp, but the date was wrong. It was dated the previous autumn, before the blizzard, before the bell rang, before the charter was found. "This order is stale," Nicholas said, his voice quiet but clear. "It was issued when the church was still abandoned, but the church is no longer abandoned. We have a congregation, we have a charter, we have a claim." The land agent, a thin man with a nervous twitch, cleared his throat. "The boy's right, Mr. Borden. An active congregation voids a deconsecration order. If they've reformed the church, they're not reformed until the bishop says so," Borden snapped. But the agent was already shaking his head. "The charter reversion is recorded in the county ledger. I checked it this morning. The Crawley claim is genuine. The land can't be sold without his consent." Nicholas stared at Borden, and for the first time there was no fear in his expression, only a steady, exhausted calm. "You tried to drown this church," he said, "but water doesn't break what's already broken. It just moves around it, and we've already learned how to move it back." Borden's face went tight with rage, but before he could speak, a low rumble echoed from the hillside upstream. Every head turned. The sound was not loud, but it was deep, a grinding bass note that vibrated through the soles of their boots. The clear-cut slope had begun to slide. Mud and rock and icy meltwater were shearing away in a single, unstoppable mass, gaining speed as it funneled toward the sluice. The flood was not coming, it was already here. There was no time for argument. Borden scrambled backward, suddenly terrified of the destruction he had set in motion. The land agent fled toward the road, but the people of Ashford did not run. They moved to their positions, each person knowing exactly where to stand because Nicholas had drilled them a dozen times in the dark. Harlan swung an axe to knock loose the final brace that would open the primary diversion channel. Joseph Pike lit a lantern and held it high so everyone could see the berm lines. Anne Harlan pulled children and the elderly into the church vestibule, where the foundation was strongest. And Nicholas Crawley, the boy who had been buried alive beneath the floor, climbed onto the church roof and stood beside the bell tower, watching the black water surge toward them. The flood hit the first berm with a sound like a cannon blast. The angled beams caught the current and tore it in half, flinging one sheet of water toward the old sawmill sluice, and another into a shallow gravel basin Nicholas had dug with his own hands. The water screamed, foaming white and brown, but the baffles held. The second berm split the remaining current again, and the third reduced it to a series of hissing runnels that spread harmlessly across the frozen meadow. The church shuddered as the water passed, and the bell above Nicholas's head gave a single, low hum from the vibration. But the foundation did not crack. The tower did not fall. The flood that was meant to erase St. Agnes from the earth was spent, broken apart by a boy who had learned from winter storms and cedar rings that the strongest force could be filtered by the smallest, wisest interruptions. When the last of the water drained away, leaving behind a field of mud and scattered debris, the silence was immense. Harlan stood in the muck, his axe still in his hand, staring at the church that still stood. Anne emerged from the vestibule, her face pale but unbroken. Joseph Pike lowered his lantern and let out a long, shuddering breath. Then, one by one, the people of Ashford began to laugh, not from humor, but from the sheer impossible relief of being alive in a place that should have been destroyed. Nicholas climbed down from the roof, his legs barely holding him, and was caught by a dozen hands that guided him gently to the ground. A week later, Father Harmon arrived. The circuit preacher was a young man with sun-bleached hair and a voice that sounded like it had been shaped by windswept plains. He rode into Ashford on a mule, carrying a worn Bible and a letter from the bishop. He expected to find a ruin. Instead, he found a church with new mortar between its stones, a bell that still hung in its tower, and a congregation of 17 families who had already pledged their faith. He stood in the sanctuary looking at the restored pews, the swept floor, the stove that glowed with a steady fire. "How did this happen?" he asked. Harlan gestured toward Nicholas, who was sitting quietly in the back, still wrapped in the same old coat, still thin as a fence post. "That boy did it," Harlan said. "We threw him out and he crawled under the floor and rebuilt the whole place before we had the courage to pick up a hammer ourselves." Father Harmon walked slowly to the back of the church and knelt beside Nicholas. "I've read the charter," he said. "I know your grandfather gave this land. The bishop has agreed that the reversion clause is valid. This building is yours by right, Nicholas Crawley. But a church needs a caretaker, someone to ring the bell, light the stove, and keep the walls standing. Do you want that duty?" Nicholas looked up at the cracked ceiling he had propped, the window he had sealed with grain sacking, the bell rope that still bore the spliced cord from his pocket. He did not answer with words. He simply nodded, and the congregation that had once voted to banish him rose to their feet in a quiet, unanimous welcome. That spring, the bell of St. Agnes rang every Sunday morning, and to the astonishment of everyone who remembered its old, flat, cracked note, the sound had changed. It was not the bell that had changed. When Nicholas had been buried under the floor, splicing the rope in the dark, he had not only repaired the line, he had adjusted the clapper's strike point by a fraction of an inch, shifting it from the cracked edge to a solid, resonant place on the bell's crown. The mechanism had always been capable of a true note. It had simply been striking the wrong part of itself for years. The town had called the bell broken, just as they had called Nicholas a burden. But the bell had never been broken. It had just been waiting for someone to give it a better angle. The timber company did not return. Borden was dismissed when the county surveyor found evidence of deliberate drainage tampering, and the hillside was replanted with young pine. Years later, when travelers asked about the sturdy little church at the edge of Ashford, locals would tell them the story of the winter the bell rang from beneath the snow. Some called it a miracle. Others called it frontier justice. But the ones who truly understood knew it was something simpler. A boy who had nothing gave everything to a place that no one wanted, and in return, that place gave him not just a home, but a voice that still rings every Sunday morning across the prairie, clear and unwavering, calling the faithful to remember that sometimes the things we throw away are the very things that hold us together. The story of Nicholas Crawley and the Bell of St. Agnes is not just a frontier legend. It is a question that still echoes across every small town that has ever turned its back on someone in need. Ashford locked its church and cast out a boy they believed was worthless. But the boy they threw away became the only thing standing between them and total loss. He did not just save a building. He exposed the hidden cracks in an entire community's moral foundation, the same way water found the weaknesses in the limestone. And when the flood came, those cracks had to be faced. Think about that for a moment. The timber company's sabotage, the diverted drainage, the bishop's stale order, all of those threats were external. But the real danger, the one that almost killed Nicholas, was the town's own willingness to discard a person they had deemed a burden. If the blizzard had not trapped him under that floor, if the bell had not rung, Ashford would have lost its church and never known it. Worse, they would have lost the chance to reckon with their own cruelty. The bell did not just save Nicholas, it gave the town a way back to itself. And that is the haunting truth at the heart of this story. Sometimes the thing we dismiss as broken is exactly what we need most. The bell was never truly cracked beyond use. It was only ever striking the wrong part of its own crown. All it needed was someone to adjust the angle. Nicholas, likewise, was never a burden. He was a gift the town refused to open. And by the time they finally unwrapped it, he had already rebuilt their soul from the crawl space up. So we are left with a question you have to answer for yourself. Was Nicholas Crawley simply lucky that winter? A boy who stumbled into a strange set of circumstances and survived because a bell happened to still hang in a tower? Or did he survive because he refused to stop caring for a place that had rejected him, long enough for the people around him to finally see their own reflection in his work? Perhaps survival has less to do with strength or cleverness, and more to do with stubborn devotion to something larger than ourselves. That question is not just about one orphan in the 1880s. It is about every person who has ever been told they have no value and found a way to prove that assessment wrong. It is about the forgotten places that hold up a community from below, unseen and unthanked. And it is about the bells that still wait in every abandoned church, every neglected heart, needing only someone willing to climb into the dark and pull the rope. If stories like this one remind you that history is never as simple as the victors write it, then we have something in common. Subscribe now to witness more forgotten sagas of the frontier, where ordinary people faced impossible winters and emerged with truths that still ring across the prairie. The next storm is already gathering. Will you be there when the bell tolls again?